right. Our first video we're going to be watching today, Into the Light was better. Rite of the 9 retrospective. This is a video here from Mr. Llama. I'm being told it's a pretty good video. Let's take a look.
Right, hello guys, welcome back. Now that the Reprise Prophecy dungeon has finally released, we've essentially seen all that's on offer with the Rite of the 9 event, because now we've played all 3 dungeons and have had the opportunity to grind for all 12 unique weapons. In a little over a week from when this video releases, all 3 dungeons will be made available until the release of the Edge of Fate expansion, more or less marking the end of the overall time gating. And yes, I do say more or less, since there is supposed to be one final Lootapalooza, as Bungie are calling it, during the final week, involving a new way to spend your event currency. And from the footage we have of people who snuck into the secret chamber, it just looks like we'll be able to buy exactly what weapon we want by interacting with its respective podium. So that won't have any
Is anybody excited about the Lootapalooza? I'm not, like, I honestly, I'm like, I've got the few rolls that I need. Maybe I get a go. I might get a God roll code comfort. Kinda, hell no. I guess if you don't have a sudden death, the trench barrel 1-2 punch shotgun roll, then perhaps, you know.
Bearing on what we're talking about today, which is giving my thoughts on the Rite of the 9 event as a whole and critiquing exactly what I enjoyed and exactly what I believe could have been handled better. And we're going to be making lots of comparisons to Into the Light, since both of these events are similar in the sense that they bridge the gap between the final season of the year and the upcoming expansion. So without further ado, let's begin. Arguably the biggest pain point when it comes to Rite of the 9 is the quality of the loot on offer. And by this point, it's no secret that the majority of the weapons available are just extremely mid. The majority of the perk rolls, with a few exceptions like the 1-2 punch trench barrel shotgun, are not particularly strong, and overall don't offer something new or unique over currently earnable drops. Not only that, a good portion of the weapons are in general just really unpopular or weak archetypes to begin with. The Waveframe New Pacific Epitaph is a weapon archetype from a long gone meta that has been wildly outclassed by newer weapons like rocket sidearms, especially in the form of Tinashe's Mastery, and the list goes on. Long arm.
Dude, let me just ask you though, for real, grenade launcher to grenade launcher, does anyone here use waveframes anymore? For me personally, aerial denials have completely taken off. Like, that's all if I put on an ad clearing GL, it is aerial denial every single time.
No Survivors, Terminus Horizon, Greasy Luck, all of these are just straight up mid-weapon archetypes that aren't exactly bad, but are nothing to really write home about.
No.
On the flip side, most of the Into the Light weapons were meta-defining and highly sought after. Think things like Edge Transit, Hammerhead, Midnight Coup, and of course the Mountaintop. Plus, these weapons were especially future-proof, which is another important point of discussion. Early on, even before the Brave Arsenal was in our hands, Bungie told us that all 12 weapons coming with Into the Light were going to be enhanceable within the final shape, because it was with the release of the final shape that game-wide weapon enhancement officially became a thing. And just knowing that the weapons we were grinding for would 100% have a place in the new system and were, as a result, actually becoming more powerful was a very welcome thing to hear, and certainly encouraged grinding for them even more. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for the Rite of the 9 weapon, since despite Bungie stating that a fully enhanced double perk adept drop is roughly equivalent to a tier 3 weapon in the Edge of Fate, the weapons themselves aren't actually being tiered and I believe are instead defaulting to tier 1, as is the case with all of our current legendary weapons once the DLC drops. So unlike Into the Light, the weapons this time round aren't making a healthy transition into the new system, which as a result somewhat kills the motivation to chase them. In fact,
dude, it completely kills it for me. I mean, how many times when we reviewed any of the Into the Light weapons last year were we like, look, it's good right now, but once you can enhance this perk or that perk, it's going to be substantially better. We all knew that what we were grinding for last year for Into the Light would play a pivotal role for us going into Final Shape, Salvation's Edge, all that stuff. And it was the ability to upgrade those weapons and enhance it in the new expansion. We can't do that. That's not the case at all for the Rite of the 9 weapons.
I was discussing this with my good friend Core Projects, and he mentioned that it would have been way cooler if Bungie shipped the Rite of the 9 weapons as the first and only set that included the new tiering system as a sort of teaser for Edge of Fate. It also could have given way to bragging rights like, oh, I got my tier 5 before they officially became a thing, or they could at least bring them all up to a tier 5 as a guarantee when the DLC drops, which definitely would make things more interesting to...
Dude, that would have been huge. It would have been the first set of weapons to roll out that you could get up to tier 5. Do you know how many people would be grinding? You know how many people would be... I didn't even think about that, because like I was like, maybe there's just a way that you could just get the weapons and perhaps you could just upgrade it, you know, the next expansion. No, straight up just have the tier system applied to just these set of weapons. Also, the other side of things is this would differentiate itself between the refresh that Prophecy already got last year. Yo, keep in mind, guys, last year we got a refresh of perks to Prophecy weapons. To then just get another refresh of perks. Granted, yes, some of the perks that left and some of the new perks that got put on these weapons are better, but there really is no, I mean, it's still crossing over. You get the new origin trait. All right, you know what I mean? Whereas a tier system would be like, oh shit, no, this is different. And it would have really gotten everybody hyped to be on board for the new loot system,
to say the least. As a result of the weapons being average, the replayability of the dungeons themselves is also impacted and makes them more of a one and done experience once you get the one role you kinda wanted. Whereas with Into the Light, the loot was so good you would simply not stop playing. However, one of the really positive additions related to loot was the inclusion of guaranteed dungeon exotics from the weekly quests. There was one week where you could choose between either Hierarchy of Needs, the Navigator, or the Galahorn Catalyst. And just this week, we were once again able to choose between Hierarchy of Needs and the Navigator once again, which is fantastic for players who don't run dungeons a lot or have struggled with RNG. And especially since most of these dungeons are several years old at this point, it has absolutely no bearing on the perceived rarity of the exotics either. I'd rather that newer players have a fun new toy to play with that hopefully encourages more participation in future raid and dungeon content. Furthermore, Bungie absolutely nailed the aesthetic of these weapons, especially with the shinies. The Galaxy texture is super clean and is, in my opinion, better looking than the Brave Arsenal shinies. The next topic I want to briefly discuss is the lack of desirable cosmetics that Rite of the Nine shipped with, since if we look back to Into the Light, it had several worthwhile cosmetic chases like the Super Black shader, awesome emblems for beating each Pantheon difficulty, and of course the Godslayer title. And circling back to Super Black, the shader was so iconic that it literally spawned an entire fashion demographic, that being the Super Black Hunter. And unfortunately, Rite of the Nine doesn't really compare. Admittedly, the emblems for beating each dungeon are pretty clean, but they don't have the same source that the Pantheon ones did. But the shader on offer is just totally buns. It would have been way cooler if there was a shader that made your armor look like the Galaxy texture from the shinies that you got for beating each dungeon on Ultimatum difficulty, for example. Into the Light also gave each class a brand new armor set, again something which Rite of the Nine hasn't.
Dude, I've honestly forgotten just how much we got Into the Light. Hot damn it, brother. We got so much stuff. To me, it's like the whole year was just kind of like a blur together. I forgot just how much stuff came with Into the Light, and not even including Pantheon. Dude, it really was peak. I'm telling you, Final Shade would not have done as well as it did without Into the Light.
Done, but at least to me this isn't as important, though it would have been cool to see the flawless trials of the 9 ornaments come back in some way. Again, they could have been a unique reward from the Ultimatum difficulties. Overall, the quality of the cosmetics could have done with a little extra sauce. The next major pain point that deserves a good amount of criticism was the initial content rollout, because in the beginning it was going to be one dungeon lasting 3 entire weeks that then rotated to another one, and then the same would happen again, meaning that if things stayed as they were originally planned, we wouldn't have seen Spire of the Watcher again for a month and a half, which frankly was a terrible idea, and due to waves of community backlash, Bungie made it a 2-week rotation rather than 3, which is still not ideal, but it was far better than before. They also made it so the second week of each featured dungeon would drop guns from defeated enemies and would also have increased currency gains. This also means that if you're playing the event more casually, why bother playing in the first week when you can wait for week 2 and play then instead, since it drops more loot. The system was flawed from the start and always should have been 1 dungeon per week on a rotational basis, so it would simply go Spire, Ghost, Prophecy, then Spire again, and so on, with the final week of the event featuring all 3 at once. Time gating is honestly fine if done right, but the initial rotation was far too egregious. And actually, Into the Light had a similar problem where they were initially going to release 1 new weapon per week to grind for, but again, after much backlash, this was changed to 2 weapons per week instead. So no points go to Into the Light on this issue, it was also guilty. A comparison I've seen regarding the 2 events is the newness of the activities, since at the time, Onslaught was completely new and had never been in the game before, and while yes, the maps did reuse Crucible arenas, the actual mode itself was entirely novel. The same cannot be said for the reprised dungeons since we already had them in the game, but a counterpoint to this is also that Pantheon was reissued raid encounters, but arguably in a more creative way than Rite of the Nine did it, because again, the actual concept of the activity was new, which does lead nicely to my next point, the actual quality of the activities themselves. The Pantheon encounter changes were fresh and often times very exciting. The Tormentor spam was maybe a little over the top, but I'm sure people clearly remember Rulk spawning a clone of himself, the patched Riven Cheese, and the chaos of -20 Nezarec, which doesn't really translate over to the Rite of the Nine dungeons. That said though, I don't think it's entirely fair to compare them one to one. In fact, I think the dungeons were a clear highlight of the event, with the changes being received pretty well across the board. Spire of the Watcher added additional combat challenges per encounter in the form of several new mini-bosses scattered throughout that blocked your path forward. Ghost of the Deep was actually my favorite because rather than adding mechanics, Bungie instead stripped it down by making first encounter last only 3 rounds and made the boss shields almost non-existent. Plus, the really long transition also awarded an extra loot chest, so despite how long it takes to do, at least you get rewarded for it
Ghost
now.
is actually my favorite.
I'd go so far as to say that with the changes, Ghost of the Deep has actually become a pretty solid dungeon, and I really hope they consider adding them to the base version in future. As a side note to this though, it has to be said that the modifiers for these activities were seriously unwelcome, at least in my opinion. Not swap is an entire can of worms that I best not delve into too deeply, but if you want my take, having played each dungeon with it on hasn't actually been that bad, at least from a Titan perspective. Most of the time I ran with Curus, and yeah, it would have been nice to have Skullfort in my neutral game setup, but I got used to it. Still though, I would prefer if it wasn't there to begin with, but it was definitely nowhere near as bad as some people thought. The real modifier that was far more evil than not swap was, in my opinion, attrition. The one where your health doesn't regen until you collect the health orbs on the ground, and especially in Prophecy this week, it's been absolutely atrocious and makes the whole experience feel terrible. There were so many times I died on 1 HP where I wouldn't have normally if my health could just regenerate. And the same can be said for the grenade modifier Scorched Earth, where enemies spam their grenade attack far more often. And in the case of Ghost of the Deep, this one was active during week 2 and made it such a pain in the ass. Samuma would not stop throwing one-tap pulse grenades, and Acolytes would constantly spam you with fire pit grenades. In my humble opinion, oppressive modifiers like these belong nowhere near contest level content, and instead I would much rather have the Pantheon approach that had more tame modifiers like Grounded or Arachno that were balanced by fun, positive modifiers like Shotcaller or Class Warfare or even Elemental Surges, since Rite of the Nine had none of these. So please Bungie, stop putting attrition in an otherwise really fun activity. Circling back to the dungeon changes,
how do y'all feel about that? What's y'all's thought on like attrition really was evil? I mean, it's one thing to have it in just regular content, another thing to put it in like a contest mode environment. Attrition should be deleted. I like Llama's take on Pantheon. Pantheon did a really good job of you had a few negative modifiers, but you had these positive modifiers that would offset it.
Prophecy also had some solid ones made that spice up the usual flow, and in general I always appreciate when we get more contest level activities to play. They feel rewarding to complete and help you to improve at the game. And speaking of, by far the biggest win of the entire event is hands down the addition of Explorer mode and the catering to new and inexperienced players. Being able to launch the dungeon on an easy difficulty with super relaxed conditions like 5-second respawns, no darkness zones, and reduced health pools plus a damage amplification if you go in solo is super awesome. It gives players who are either new or inexperienced with the endgame a chance to dip their toes and see if they like it, especially since the mode easily guides you through the mechanics with the helpful in-world tooltips that describe exactly what must be done to achieve the end goal, which is a really good way to teach the dungeon without players needing to look up a guide on YouTube. And also, Explorer mode mirrors the base version of the dungeon. None of the Rite of the Nine specific changes are active here, meaning they can take that knowledge and apply it to the normal dungeons once Rite of the Nine is over. I've heard nothing but good things about this mode, and I've also personally praised it plenty of times, and it's a clear step in the right direction for all endgame content, and I hope Bungie takes the feedback from this initial iteration and begin plans to roll it out for all future dungeons and perhaps even raids if the infrastructure can be supported. Ironically, the same cannot be said for Into the Light, and if I remember correctly, it was actually one of the main criticisms of the event, especially with Pantheon, where it was always going to be anti-new player since there was no matchmaking and you needed to form a pre-made group. And when it came to the higher difficulties, I'm sure you can imagine it became even more daunting than it already was. While maybe not as difficult, you could make the same argument for Expert Wave 50 Onslaught, since one wrong move on a Tormentor augment could cost your team the entire run if you weren't adequately prepared to deal with it. And again, it didn't have matchmaking either. Closing out with some more general items, overall it felt like Rite.
Yeah, this is where it's like, there's things that I want, things that I enjoy. Like I truly enjoyed Pantheon, but did the majority of the community not like Pantheon? Would they prefer, something more approachable, like the Explorer mode version of these dungeons? You know what I mean? Pantheon had me bricked up. Pantheon was f***ing S tier. Nothing really comes close. Pantheon wasn't solo player friendly. Well, it's a raid though, too. You know what I mean? Like it's a raid. Here's my suggestion. And I've said this for years. Open up matchmaking. Put matchmaking on everything. Let people go in there with whoever. And look, will it be catastrophic? Maybe 70% of the time. Perhaps. But maybe you get someone out of that group. 1, if you're lucky. 2, that you connect with. And you could play with them. You can create relationship with them. Just load up and go, man.
Rite of the Nine was just, how can I put this, less polished overall. There were several minor inconveniences, like not being able to get down from the 2nd or 3rd chest platforms, having sparrows be summonable in the social space during the 1st week, only to have them be taken away from the 2nd week onwards, no damage being shown on the scoreboard after you kill the final boss in both Spire and Prophecy, and the loot chest not telling you how much currency is consumed when purchasing a drop. There's also the gripe that Rite of the Nine had way less content than Into the Light, because the latter came with a brand new horde mode activity, a raid boss gauntlet, and a couple reprised exotic missions, and Rite of the Nine only had 3 dungeons and a returning social space from year 1. But to be honest, I don't think this is entirely fair, since it's clear that Rite of the Nine was always going to be a smaller event, and to innovate to the same extent that Into the Light did would have been a very tall task indeed, but that isn't to say it was good enough as is. I think a great addition to the dungeons would be to have a mini pantheon alongside them, where it took the boss encounters from all the featured dungeons and blended them all together into a single boss rush mode, and perhaps bringing in some other dungeon encounters too, like Corrupted Puppeteer, the Nightmare of Keitel, and Ethan's Vengeance. But perhaps this was too big a task for Bungie to complete.
It would have been
I also
great,
want to give a brief mention to the Spire of the Watcher Ultimatum speedrun tournament that Bungie ran for the entire community with the promise of the Movie of the Week emblem as a reward. And I think little events like these are awesome ways to get the community interacting with the content, especially since a highly sought after emblem was the featured reward, and I hope they continue to host more of these in the future. In conclusion, Rite of the Nine is unfortunately no Into the Light. It suffers from a bad loot problem as well as a needlessly time-gated release schedule that could have and should have been avoided. But that doesn't detract from its positives, like how well it integrates inexperienced players into dungeon content and provides a welcome challenge for experienced veterans, with the clear highlight of the event being the dungeons themselves. That said though, the standard set by Into the Light was always going to be hard to live up to, and despite Rite of the Nine being a smaller event overall, were it not for the aforementioned weaknesses like the weapons and content rollout, I firmly believe that this event would have been far more highly regarded, despite its smaller size. I hope that if any Bungie employees watching find my feedback valuable and consider taking it into account for the next time an event like this rolls around. And despite the drawbacks, I still had a really fun time playing the event, and it was indeed a welcome addition to the usual dry period leading into the next expansion. Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments below, and don't be afraid to challenge my talking points. I'm always keen to appreciate new perspectives. Anyway, that's all for today. I hope you enjoyed my analysis, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now, dear viewer.
Good video, Llama. I felt like Llama, I mean, he gave a great assessment here across the board. To me, the lead up to an expansion is so important. When we look back, you would not have seen the success that Final Shape got without Into Light and Pantheon. You would not have gotten the success of Forsaken without Warmind and the Whisper mission. There have been times in the past where Bungie has been in trouble and they've over-delivered, and man, it has really paid off for them. Or at least we hope it paid off for them. You know, I read a comment yesterday and it really was just demoralizing. It essentially was talking about Into the Light and how Rite of the Nine just doesn't live up to the standard that Bungie established themselves last year. And you got to understand, guys, the hype level last year with Into the Light Pantheon was off the charts. It was fantastic. We had competitions going on, that the little small tournament going on for Pantheon. You know, every week felt like it brought something new. Onslaught was just such a great activity to replay over and over again. We were testing builds constantly, and they were builds that we were just trying to see, like, would this work in Final Shape? The comment, though, that I came across yesterday that was so demoralizing is that someone essentially just said something along the lines of, yeah, Bungie over-delivered last year with Into the Light Pantheon and Final Shape, and yet there were still layoffs. It's a fair assessment, but I gotta just imagine, like, if you do everything you can for the community, it pops, and we love it, yet somehow, some way, there's still, you know, a number of layoffs that occur afterwards. Yes, make good products. That's what we're trying to say, Dick. Into the Light and Pantheon, as well as Final Shape, was a superb product with fantastic numbers, and yet there were still layoffs. But look, imagine this. Imagine this. I don't know what the numbers are going to be for Edge of Fate. I hope it's good. I really do. I hope it's good. I hope people enjoy it. But if you were issuing layoffs After, think about this. Post Lightfall, we got layoffs. Post Final Shape, we got layoffs. All right, both of those, just on Steam alone, clocked in over 300,000 concurrent players for the month they release, or the day one. So then run that forward. Let's run this forward. Let's play an experiment. If Edge of Fate launches, imagine a world where it's less than half that. Imagine a world where that concurrent player number is less than half of what was put up from Lightfall and Final Shape. If you laid off 8, 9, 10% of your workforce post Lightfall, post Final Shape, holy fuck. I can't imagine what would actually be if it was truly a failure, or quote unquote failure, in terms of actual player counts, because we haven't really had that. We've had increased concurrent viewership or increased concurrent players, expansion over expansion. There was a small drop back from Lightfall to Final Shape, but still really good numbers, over 300,000 concurrent on Steam. Anyways, listen, for me, Into the Light, Pantheon, all that stuff was just way, way better. And I feel like even after Guardian Games this year, because we got that boss rush mode, I think that was a great idea that Llama brought up. Imagine that there was some sort of boss rush mode that was alongside this event. And then it also incorporated even other dungeon encounters. I think that would have been really, really cool.
Slap that like button like your mama told you right.